All right, welcome, Megan.
Hi. Hi, good evening. I'm Megan with Oz. Tonight we'll be discussing Shelterbelts and Ecobuffers. To start off with, we've got a bit of land acknowledgement. So in conducting our presentation, we respectfully acknowledge that Oz operates on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the home of the Métis. Our workshop tonight is supported through our partnership with Grand Prairie County, as well as with the Canadian Agriculture Partnership, who supported the development of this workshop. So Bob and I, we're both representatives of Oz, Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. So Oz is a not-for-profit organization. We operate in Alberta, and we share with others the value of trees. So our mission is to provide education, resources, support for landowners or municipalities or not-for-profits to develop that knowledge, that capacity for ecosystem restoration, as well as put the pieces together for successful restoration projects. So we can help design site plans, we can help support funding for projects, support some of the technical pieces that need to come together for a successful project, and provide feedback or support when things maybe aren't going how people are expecting them to go. We also share education on stewardship, conservation, and woodlot management as well. So we have a bit of everything with respect to value of trees. So a bit about us. I'm Megan Andrew. I'm the Executive Director at Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. My background is in kind of traditional agriculture as well as conservation and reclamation planning. I've got a few years of grants experience and overall project management experience I bring to the team. Bob Underschultz, he's our Senior Environmental Technician. Bob's also got a background in conservation biology. He's kind of the technical support to a lot of our tree health management tools, develops lots of our technical information, and he really works with our stakeholders to help develop those individual planting plans. Brianna Wallace as well, she's on our team, and you'll meet her if you're working with us. She does a lot of the environmental coordination and the digital media tools that we bring to support learning about the environment. Let's see. All right, so Oz really works at a community level to promote sustainability, connectivity, and to develop resiliency. So we work to bring together like those rural groups of stakeholders. So from working with our county representatives like Jill and Kate, we really work to come together and bring in resources from local organizations. So in the Grand Prairie area, we're likely working with Cows and Fish. We're working with the Mighty Peace Watershed Association. We're working with the Alberta Conservation Association. So we're really working to bring together all of the different partners and stakeholders so that we are building that capacity through restoration projects. We're building that local knowledge, and we're building that success. So landowners like yourselves and others in the area can have those successful project experience to base their planting on. So together we can support each other and really build a great capacity for ecosystem services and success in those projects. Right. So a little bit of background on our organization. So in working with community sustainability and resiliency, we're really working to address some of the anthropogenic changes that have occurred in our landscape over the last century. So right now, approximately 2/3 of the province, 62%, has been altered by industrial or agricultural activity. Agricultural activity. So this this alteration, it impacts our environment in a few different ways. So one of the ways it impacts our environment can be known as habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation, and you can see in the pictures here, is it's when our native environment is fragmented through areas of development across the landscape. So all of those different land uses, agricultural, industrial, the roadways, they create barriers to our native species moving across the landscape. And this can lead to ecosystem decay. It can lead to losses of ecosystem services in local areas. And this is important because some of those losses can really lead to isolations of different populations, which can lead to inbreeding in some of our native wildlife, leading to lower survival rates, loss of natural selection, and just reduced competition from both that native flora and fauna. So basically, what I'm saying is that fragmentation can starve those habitat fragments. It can reduce all of the different natural inputs that are needed to create that healthy ecosystem. So where Oz comes in, we're working with landowners, agricultural producers, we're working with municipalities, and we're sharing those same environmental values and goals. So using that approach of everyone working together, we can bring together different areas of expertise and pull together projects that can act to restore wildlife corridors or riparian buffers, can act to restore ecobuffers and woodlots themselves. So we're working to create that landscape of connectivity between projects that overall leads to greater habitat and greater natural areas in Alberta. So this in itself will result in greater resiliency. Another growing factor due to climate change and their impacts in our native environment. We're looking to increase those ecosystem services. We're increasing that diversity. And again, we're going right back to resiliency there. So we're really working to create a robust and healthy environment through that landscape connectivity. So speaking of connectivity, we have our topic for tonight. We're going to be discussing Shelterbelts and Ecobuffers. So to go back to just the basic definition of what a Shelterbelt is, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with Shelterbelts. They are those age-old infrastructure across the agricultural landscape. And so the main purpose of these buffers of trees was to reduce wind speed. So going right back to that Dust Bowl of the 1930s, shelter belts were implemented across agricultural lands to just reduce wind speed to stop soil erosion. So these structures can be a single row of trees. Typically, there are a few rows of trees. We're looking at a lot of those shelter belt species that were distributed by the PFRA. In the photos here, you can see some of our traditional forms. We've got in the bottom picture that row of is it caragana or maybe willow. We've got our hybrid poplar in the middle, and then we've got white spruce there on the edge. So this shelter belt is going to provide some basic ecosystem services with moving that wind up and over the shelter belt. It's going to provide a small amount of habitat there for wildlife, for a small amount of biodiversity, given that it is only those 3 species. And it looks like there may be some maintenance done to make sure that those species stay in their weed-free rows as well. Let's see. So shelter belts, by design, they're a low diverse physical layering of species. So they're planted basically uniform in space and structure. So you're looking at the same thing all the way down the row. They're often creating that wedge or dome shape, which is important for their function, given that they're designed to move wind up and over. And then we're looking at typically a combination of some deciduous shrubs and fast growing trees, as well as usually a slower growing coniferous tree, so lodgepole pine or white spruce as well. So these shelter belts, reducing wind speed, again, it's not as pertinent today as it was previously. We've seen a major shift in agricultural management, more towards no-till systems. So we're less looking at reducing wind speed for soil erosion due to that black earth every spring and fall, but we're still looking to those structures to reduce wind speeds on our landscape. Wind speeds are often pretty predictable. We've got a couple maps here from Alberta government. They're different in the spring, summer versus in the fall, winter. So when you're designing those structures, we do want to look back on our prevailing wind maps to have a reference there. And we're looking to design our shelter belts for the ecosystem services that they will provide. So taking into account the direction of our winds is important. Sometimes we can look to intended or unintended results of our shelter belt. So while we are looking to reduce soil erosion, we also have that side effect of trapping snow. So when we're designing our shelter belts, we really want to make sure that we're looking at both the intended outcomes of our shelter belt and some of the unintended outcomes. So we've got some great intended outcomes. We've got agroforestry there with our cattle utilizing the physical shelter of their shelter belt. And then in the bottom there, we can see how shelter belts are as well capturing snow. We'll talk a bit more about that in some future slides as well. All right, so snow capturing and wind speed. Shelter belts really do prevent those high wind speeds across our agricultural landscape. So in looking at this figure here, you'll notice wind speed reductions of up to 20 times the height of your shelter belt, and more reductions within the 10 and 15 times the height of your shelter belt. So if we're looking at, for example, where our farmyard is in that distance from our shelter belt, we can really predict the reductions in wind speed, especially when we're planting them, keeping in mind the direction of our prevailing winds. All right, so shelter for livestock and farmyards is a big one. I know a lot of folks are contacting us to discuss shelter belt placement and the best design to make use of the structures on their property and the cost that goes into developing a shelter belt. So we've got some statistics here. Shelter belts can be found, we've got one study in particular, shelter beef cattle can be found to have gained 35 pounds more during the winter where they have access to a sheltered area, such as that sheltered by a shelter belt. As well, 10 to 15% less feed is consumed in areas where they are seeking shelter from that shelter belt service. So trees really work to reduce the stress due to weather. And that's both in the winter here, you can see through the picture, but also in the summer as well. So reducing that stress from perhaps cold as well as hot or rain really helps maintain the overall health of the animal. Again, thinking about our home quarter there, and it can be, studies have been found that having shelter belts properly placed around a property can help reduce heating costs for buildings. Agriculture Canada has just posted up to 25% reduced heating costs for buildings when there are proper shelter belts in place. So not just heat, I guess also beautification. There's many shelter belt services there. Wildlife habitat, increases to real estate values, lots of different opportunities for making use of those tree services. All right, so meanwhile in nature, and this is always, once we get into our presentation on shelter belts and ecobuffers, we can talk about the shelter belts, and many people are familiar with those structures. But what's the evolution of a shelter belt? So meanwhile in nature, we're looking at a very diverse forest structure. We're looking at lots of different native species working together to provide those services. We're looking at lots of different ecosystem functions of trees, each supporting each other, optimizing the environment for growth and health and survival. So by planting diverse buffers or ecobuffers, using diverse trees and shrubs with different characteristics, we're going to see ecosystem services such as suckering or native propagation. We're going to see more species diversity and catchment of the ground. So we're going to see less weeds developing. We're going to see nitrogen fixation. We're going to see lots of different wildlife habitat developed. We're going to see all of the ecosystem services working together, supporting each of the species in the planting. So by using this high density landscape design, we can really seek to capture a lot of those different services our native forested areas offer. To maximize these services as well, we're looking to connect to existing natural areas. And really, we're just looking to mimic those natural services offered by a forest. So we can make use of marginal areas of our land or those alternative areas on our property for looking at agricultural property. A lot of the times they're more ecologically sensitive. So perhaps we can look to the riparian areas on a property and enhance those areas by connecting to ecobuffers, providing shelter for landowners as well. All right, so ecobuffers. And in our photo here, we have just a small photo of an ecobuffer island. So depending on the area of land that you have available for your ecobuffers, we can look to optimize our ecosystem services just based on that. Here in the photo, we have a small ecobuffer island, but it's still offering many different services. So looking at the diversity from all of the different native trees planted, the density of that planting as well, we can look to all of the different ecosystem services provided. We're looking towards long-term development of the ecosystem there, as well as the potential, I suppose. So in selecting different species for your ecobuffer, you can look to your native forests nearby and select really the ecosystem services that you want to bring into your ecobuffer. So if you're looking to attract different species of wildlife, you can look to those species that they're favoring. These ecobuffer designs are often irregular, mimicking our natural forest. While costs can be a bit higher in the upfront, you're initially going to be planting more seedlings than you are if you're planting a traditional shelter belt. The overall costs are lower in that you're going to see these native species propagating and suckering, and you'll see reduced maintenance costs through lower need for weed management, for example, or tilling or fertilizing or watering your shelter or your ecobuffer versus maintaining your shelter belt. All right, so the ecological role of native trees and shrubs in the forest. So in our shelter belt, we have a few different types of trees and shrubs. We have our short trees and shrubs, which provide the understory of our planting project. So there's lots of great species to pick from your understory trees and shrubs. I can talk about Bob's favorite, the red osier dogwood is kind of a great one to pull out. This species, it provides quite a dense planting. It's very resilient to browse, so wildlife in this species. It captures the understory really well, and it's great in lots of different soil moisture conditions. So while it'll do well in very wet soil, it'll do well in drier soil as well. We've got lots of great choices there as well. Many of the native species complement each other. So when we're looking to add tall shrubs, pioneer and nurse trees and long-lived trees, when you're selecting from native species, they can look to each other to support each other. So from tall shrubs, they provide that intermediate canopy layer, an important aspect for wildlife. Saskatoons, chokecherries, there's lots of typical native species there. I know looking to our list here, we've got green alder right there in the middle. That's a great species selection, for example, for its nitrogen fixing, as well as it has that nice catkins that our wildlife use as food sources. For pioneer nurse trees, these are a little bit taller. They're more of a tree than a shrub. And we're looking to these to provide that vertical structure quite quickly. So they are fast growing trees and they provide that structure for the environment for some of our other trees. So for example, the species listed there, they support our long-lived trees by providing protection from the physical elements. So those longer lived trees, they grow a little bit slower, but with the help of pioneer trees, they can be protected during their growth as well. Let's see. So advantages of the ecobuffers. So ecobuffers, they really maximize your space that you have for planting. So by using many different diverse species, native species, you're looking to optimize the number of ecosystem services that you can get from your planting project. So while you're planting them a lot closer together, that density, it's not going to compromise each of the trees. They really work together. And by having, by just having that structure there, you're going to see vast amount of services. So let's see, depending on what you're looking for, and there's more than we can list right now, but water management comes to mind, especially for ecobuffers and Shelterbelts. So these structures work to manage water in many different ways. I know we had a presentation earlier this month with Jill and Kate talking about erosion protection and mitigation using trees, reducing the risk of floods. So by maintaining forested vegetation in those riparian buffers or enhancing riparian buffers with planting, we can really increase the water holding capacity of the soil, increase infiltration of surface water into groundwater, so eliminating that overland flow. And we can reduce sedimentation access into water by trapping a lot of that material right in the forested area. Again, helping do that by slowing down the flow. There's carbon sequestration as another option, both below ground and above ground. That could be a whole presentation in itself, talking about carbon sequestration potential using ecobuffers. I know Bob and Brianna have entire presentations on pollination as well. So we've got lots of different services that can be offered based on the species that we're selecting for our ecobuffer. Of course, aesthetic and cultural value is a great wildlife or a great ecosystem service in addition to wildlife habitat. Let's see here. So we have lots of examples of the different functions that we can design our ecobuffers for. So when we're looking at our ecobuffer, we can look to the potential that we can bring through our ecosystem services to the property. So we're really going to look to our landscape, look to our kind of priorities or the services, our goals for our planting project, and then we can begin to design the project with those in mind. So for example, here we have a couple maybe targets for our planting projects. So one of these targets could be riparian ecobuffers. And in our picture here, we have a riparian ecobuffer developed along a waterway. So this is a parallel planting project. It's about up to 15 meters from the water body. So you can see it's right on the shore of the river there. These planting projects are composed of native riparian woody vegetation. We're going to use a mix of lowland and upland vegetation, and we're really going to select species based on the topography of our riparian area. So when we're planting closer to water, of course, we're going to be looking for species that have maybe shallower roots that are a little more tolerant to saturation. We're looking for some of those riparian species. As we're moving up the soil or up the banks of the riparian area, we're looking to maybe species like willows, that have some of those longer roots that maybe stabilize soil a bit more. And then once we're getting into the upper banks of the riparian area, we're looking for some of those typical pioneer species that we have in that chart there. So looking at maybe white birch or other of those longer rooted pioneer species to provide the physical structure of the upper riparian area. Together, our riparian ecobuffers can provide many ecosystem services. So they can improve the water quality, provide a physical separation for agricultural activities, for example, as well as providing an important wildlife habitat. So when we're looking at riparian ecobuffers specifically, their potential as wildlife habitat is very, very high. Wildlife are always seeking water. So when we're planting these, we often look to develop them into a wildlife corridor as well. So kind of it can be your primary or a secondary ecosystem service that you're looking for. Wildlife corridors, they're simply the connectivity of different areas of greater habitat for wildlife. So looking at the photo here, or air map, I guess, of our wildlife corridor, you can see the wildlife corridor in yellow, and we have our two areas of high quality habitat there. So we're looking to form that bridge between through our planting project. Let me see here. So our wildlife corridor can allow safe passage for wildlife. It can provide potential for food, breeding habitat, shelter, refuge, and safe travel. It can be a means to connect to those two higher quality areas of habitat, as you can see in the picture. We're going to look to design our wildlife corridors with sufficient width. I mean, as width allows, depending on the land uses. I know there can be narrower wildlife corridors do have some value, but of course a little wider is a little better, allowing more wildlife to access and use that space. So proper placement for these is also a factor to consider. If you do have some resources, you want to make the best use of those resources by picking a location for your planting project with the highest potential. So for example, looking at this map again, we can see there would be a couple different ways of connecting that those two larger quality spaces for wildlife. We can move through an Ecobuffer island approach. You can see that on the mirror of the right hand side by enhancing the smaller areas of forest within the parcel of land to connect the habitat, or you can do as the photo suggests with planting into that yellow habitat to create one continuous wildlife corridor. So planting a diverse range of species of trees and shrubs helps a diverse range of wildlife species make use of that. So the higher the biodiversity, the higher the resiliency, the better the natural pest control, the more ecosystem services, so crop pollination, habitat for birds, predatory insects, mammals. Let's see, we're looking to look to the natural features of the landscape as well. So let's see, incorporating large trees, standing bluffs, rocky outcrops. Connecting to Shelterbelts is another great opportunity out there. So just because maybe the Shelterbelts aren't native species, it doesn't mean they don't provide that habitat. They do. So connecting those with our existing and new wildlife corridors is a great idea as well. And think too, not only ecosystem services animals are looking for in summer months, for example, during breeding season, but looking to winter shelter as well. So a structure such as an Ecobuffer shelter belt with 10 or more rows of deciduous and coniferous trees provides a great winter shelter for wildlife. All right, so ecobuffers with pollinators in mind. And looking at some of those ecobuffers, we can look now even to a single row ecobuffer, and how those very small structures can provide great wildlife habitat, especially for pollinators. So by incorporating many different flowering species into our ecobuffers, even if we're looking at a very narrow ecobuffer, we can incorporate many different opportunities for pollinators. So by using flowering species that cover a diverse range of flowering periods, as well as a diverse range of bloom sizes, colors, and shapes, we can provide habitat for many different native species, native species, and other different pollinators as well. Let's see, so by improving pollination in the surrounding agricultural landscape, we can increase crop yields, we can increase opportunity for native species, and overall we can support that greater biodiversity in an area. Let's see, so now that you've learned a little bit more about kind of what ecobuffers and Shelterbelts are, and a lot of the different services that you may be interested in developing on your property, I can pass the mic over to Bob, and he'll give you a little bit of background on how to establish Shelterbelts and ecobuffers, and some of the different tools that we use to assess your land and determine kind of how to optimize the land you have available for this planting project, and then give you some ideas on different ecosystem services you may be looking to plant for, how to maintain and optimize your Shelterbelt or Ecobuffer for the long term, and some tips and tricks that we've picked up for different weed control solutions, different plant material options. All right, Bob, let's see. Over to you.
All right, let's get my screen up here. Thanks, Megan. So that looks like it's working. All right. Okay, yeah, so yeah, when it comes to kind of figuring out the best steps to effectively establish whether it's a Shelterbelt or an Ecobuffer, there's plenty of things to consider, and a lot of them come down to kind of your location and kind of the area you have to work with. So kind of getting into it, depending on your location, there are some general principles that are remain the same, regardless of whether it's by a riparian area, on a small acreage lot, alley cropping through crop fields, or setting up eco islands in pasture land. There are a few different things to consider regardless of location of the planting. So kind of have some different scenarios. First one up is nature has already done the planting, which is always nice. So this is where when you have those already existing natural areas or leftover Shelterbelts that have been kind of forgotten. Basically, any of those areas where there's already an existing ecosystem, and then you kind of want to, if you're looking to extend or build off of that natural area, you have options for pushing out from that natural area with providing extra rows to increase the width. You can also do something called root pruning, which is effective for aspen and other poplar species, where you go along with a disc and you actually disturb that soil, cut up those roots, and it encourages more suckering, so it encourages faster propagation of those species. And there's underplanting. You can enhance biodiversity, add more local native species to say an old Shelterbelt to kind of turn that into more of a natural ecosystem. So as well as connecting off that, or using that as even if it's not exactly where you're looking to plant a new planting plan, you can kind of build that into your plans to extend the reach of that planting project. And then, having to do less work is always nice. Second option is where you have those marginal areas in those landscapes that nature is, it's trying to take place there, but for whatever reason, there's, human activities, livestock activities that are kind of getting in the way of nature successfully, establishing in a natural environment there. So oftentimes those are on those marginal lands where, not ideal for growing, not ideal for pasture land for browsing, or sloped areas that are prone to erosion from livestock, or don't grow very well for crops, or any sort of other area if you have land that you don't necessarily have in agricultural production, but for whatever reason it's having a difficult time coming back. So generally, the thing is, if it's hard to farm, maybe it shouldn't be. So certain areas can oftentimes offer greater benefits being left as treat areas rather than being put into production. So basically, by kind of leaving those areas alone, or coming in with some aid in terms of providing some extra planting to give it a boost, you can help those areas kind of turn themselves into kind of what they're trying to be. So in these kind of images, you see, you can have a slope like that where livestock can really impact it via erosion, but you remove the livestock from the area, and nature can take root literally with the seedlings and other willow species suckering in and having that chance to establish themselves. Same with on the right image there, where too much browse can oftentimes leave those natural tree stands or tree buffers quite degraded, and kind of losing that understory, as an example. And then same with on the left image, you can leave that and you'll have some natural wildflowers, meadows that can take place and act as a pollinator resource. So here's just kind of a couple of quick images of root pruning in action. So you can kind of see that tractor with that hookup on the back, slicing into the soil there, disturbing those roots, and then any sort of those aspen or other popular trees, or any other kind of species that is prone to suckering. It stimulates that and really encourages that suckering to take place, and it's a really convenient way if you want to increase the boundaries of an existing shelter belt, ecobuffer, or natural area. That will definitely encourage faster regeneration beyond its already existing area. And then, yeah, finally, third option is you come in and you do the planting in areas that previously didn't have any sort of natural woody vegetation or trees kind of already existing there, whether that was from land clearing, prior land clearing, or just an area prone to any sort of activity that wasn't beneficial for the trees to be there. So this would be considered afforestation. So there are any of those planting projects where you're prepping the land and ensuring that there's going to be a successful establishment when you do end up planting those trees. So with third option, that kind of comes with the most work, as well as ensuring you're following the necessary steps to give those planted trees the best option for being successful, and then having those formative years to establish themselves securely, so that they can continue to have that long-term regenerative process in terms of an ecobuffer. So yeah, basically when it comes down to any of those options, you really want to make sure that you have your goals down pat, and kind of what your primary functions for that planting project are. So you're looking at your services. If your main goal is to reduce wind velocity, and really keep topsoil erosion down, or protect your livestock from wind chill, You want to make sure that, you're setting yourself up for success there, as far as, ensuring that you have, good species height, as well as width and, placement in terms of distance for reducing that wind velocity, as well as, when you're considering those main services, you really want to look towards your location and take into consideration all those site characteristics, that, kind of the big ones, like what's your soil like, what's the moisture in the area like, as well as, what's kind of the competition as far as if there's going to be livestock nearby or any sort of aggressive weeds, if it's in, an area like cropland where there's a really dormant weed seed bank oftentimes present. So just kind of want to make sure that you're considering all those prior, and then that you have that something in that planting plan to address those characteristics. Yeah, so again, just looking at those goals, again, kind of comes down to your location. So how much space you have is a big one. Like Megan mentioned before, those prevailing winds, you want to make sure, you're perpendicular to those at least. Oftentimes the greatest benefit is, when those prevailing winds from, fall and winter, especially for, snow catchment, if that's an issue, and reducing that wind chill. And then, yeah, if you have high compaction, certain species will do better than others, and certain species can actually alleviate that compaction, making that soil a little bit healthier, as well as if you have, certain conditions like high alkaline soils. Certain species are more salt tolerant. And then, yeah, getting into any sort of obstacles, usually if they're man-made obstacles, power lines, especially being a big one. Oftentimes you'll see with Shelterbelts on the side of the roads, whether they were planted before or after power lines were put in place. Oftentimes they have to get topped if those pioneer species such as aspen and balsam poplar grow too tall and interfere with the lines, causing the Shelterbelt to not look too great in appearance, as well as reducing their effectiveness as a wind buffer, and also the overall health of those trees, because topping isn't really good practice for overall tree health. So that's something always to consider, whether you have the space to offset that Ecobuffer or Shelterbelt, as well as if you're a little bit tighter in space, making sure that those first few species that are closest to the power line aren't having a max height that is definitely going to be under that power line, so it won't interfere, and then keeping those taller species as far back as you can that your space will allow, and then as well as always thinking about what's underground, and ensuring that any of those really pretty much any of those woody vegetative species will have that kind of really complex or deep binding root system that can potentially impact some of those underground lines. So it's always important to make sure where you are planting, above and below ground, you're considering what is there. Yeah, and then we'll just kind of go through some steps as far as establishment. So design's always a big one, and then making sure you're selecting suitable species. So we always like to suggest native species, especially native species that are local to your area, because just because one species is native to Alberta doesn't mean it's native to all of Alberta, or even certain site characteristics within its native range. So you want to make sure that you're selecting best species that are suited for the area, because that will give you the best success. And then as well as kind of figuring out your stock selection as far as size of the stock, and then doing a good job planting, because that's their first step to establishment. If you have poor planting practices, unfortunately it doesn't always lead to good success, and then ensuring that in those formative years you're doing a good job as far as maintenance, especially with Shelterbelts, as Megan mentioned before, because they have those kind of greater spacing between rows and between species. You really need that maintenance there, because losing some of those species can create a a bigger impact on the overall plan with, gaps and kind of restoring, rather than with an ecobuffer where it's a lot denser. Those species diversity is higher and they all intermix. So, a loss of one species isn't as big a deal, as well as weed control and just long-term maintenance in terms of watering tends to be less with an ecobuffer design. So yeah, kind of looking at design, there's lots of different, potential and different designs here. This is a great image, just kind of showcasing the different ways planting projects can be kind of designed with the landscape in mind. So a big consideration is, where you're planting and why are you planting it there. Oftentimes it can be, Google Earth and Google Maps are really useful for kind of getting a bird's eye view of your property, as well as if there's any, usually there's some free contour map generators online where you can use kind of that same satellite image and kind of see how your land works in terms of different elevation and where it slopes, where it's low, where it's high, and that can kind of help you figure out, okay, it's when the lower lands probably higher soil moisture content and things like that. So kind of getting that idea of where you're looking and what's nearby can give you a good start. And again, stressing that orienting, if wind is a big goal on your list, you always want to make sure that you're doing your best as far as setting it up right from the get-go. So perpendicular, so you can kind of see in the two images, but having that kind of 90 degrees there, that protected zone definitely grows a lot more. So you want to make sure you're covering all the gaps, so you're not creating any wind tunnels. So oftentimes you need access to a yard or a field or what have you, or there's already a pre-existing obstacle in the way. So rather than kind of leaving a large gap there, which can form a wind tunnel, you can do, if you have the space, plant a row in front of it offset so you still have access, or kind of staggering your planting design so that it's not a straight tunnel for the wind to kind of get channeled into. So those are some options if you have some larger areas that you just can't plant at least a continuous corridor for. Yeah, and as Megan was showing with that prior graphic for wind speed reduction, so when you're looking at catching snow drifts or kind of blocking snow or more evenly distribution of those snowfalls with the wind, you always want to consider placement of your planting project if it's close to any sort of buildings or structures on the land, because generally major snow dumping on the leeward side occurs generally around 2 times the height, sometimes more, of the the tallest point of your shelter belt. So generally, if you're including some of those larger species like white spruce can get quite tall, as well as some of the pioneer species. So kind of looking at their max height once they reach maturity and using that as a guide for kind of seeing where that snow catchment is going to be, as well as designing those shelter belts accordingly if that snow capture is kind of what you're after. Like Megan was saying with the wind, that initial shrub layer, whether it's in a wedge shape or a dome shape, if you have the room to continue that downward trend, effectively lifts up the wind, and those shrub rows are actually really effective snow trappers, almost acting like similar to snow fences that you see, and they also protect some of those taller trees from any sort of deep snow that can impact them a little more. And then those just taller pioneer trees, once it ramps off the shrubs, they kind of lift that wind ultimately up and over, as well as being a little bit more porous, especially in the winter. They kind of catch and release that snow and kind of creates a filtering effect. So rather than that snow drifting quite dense in one area, it can actually spread that across a larger area at a more even distribution. So oftentimes it can be quite beneficial to cropland, spreading out that snow. So when it's a spring spring melt, it melts evenly rather than a dense in one specific area. And then it kind of goes with what you're kind of looking at as far as options, because the denser that shelter billet is, the closer it'll trap that snow. So species like evergreens are a lot denser, especially in the winter, so they can trap the snow a bit closer too. So that's another thing to consider. So yeah, again, the biggest issue is just making sure you're far enough. Your planting plan or planting project is far enough away from areas that you would want to avoid heavy drifting of snow impacting those. Certain configurations can be work in different ways for snow capture. So a short and dense foliage design can ensure that snow is trapped and concentrated within a short distance. Whereas when you have tall and thin foliage, so more porous, it distributes it a little more evenly over a larger distance. So things to consider, when you have multiple rows in a traditional shelter built design, oftentimes that snow will just be trapped within those rows. And for areas with lower snowfall, you can oftentimes use dense shelter belts to trap that snow close to where you want it, whether it's directed at dugouts to recharge in the spring and things like that. Yeah, and then spacing and layout is a big one. So oftentimes it really comes down to the site for kind of that design layout that will work best, as well as your goals again. But typically there's some general things you can kind of go off of for just starting out. Shelter belts ideally should be a 3-row minimum is recommended, so you can get those that shrub line, that taller pioneer line, and then those long-lived conifers that'll grow up slowly while the rest are growing a bit faster. Again, spacing can be greater between rows and as well as between seedlings. And again, having that that traditional shape of a wedge shape with the growth of those species, or if you have the room, that dome shape as you go the opposite downward once you get to the leeward side. And then generally containing spruce is quite common, white spruce for the kind of the end row or the peak row in the middle. Whereas with ecobuffers, if they're in a row design, I would say generally a minimum of 4 rows would be ideal, or more. More is always better. Then you could also with ecobuffers plant them in patch designs or ecobuffer island designs where they're not necessarily linear. As well as that spacing can be quite a bit denser, so as close as half a meter between seedlings. And then if you're doing rows, that row spacing can be quite small as well. And when you're working with certain patch designs or ecobuffer island designs, you're really mimicking that forest environment rather than the linear structures that we're used to in our kind of human habitats. And then those greater diversity of those species, ultimately, if you design it correctly, can work together with each other, so they're not out competing each other and they're finding their own kind of ecological niche, whether they're a shade tolerant plant as opposed to a sun living plant, and the different heights, so they're not competing at the same level. So kind of on the left side, you kind of see for ecobuffers an example design pattern that you could potentially use, where you have those kind of those nurse trees being pioneer trees, and then taller and smaller shrubs, kind of protecting those longer lived trees. And then you have another thing to consider with planting plants is integrating a herbaceous ground cover of native wildflowers or native grasses that you can kind of seed in beforehand before you're planting, and that can also help a lot with controlling weeds, preventing them by already having that established ground cover, and a native ground cover that isn't going to be too aggressive to the new seedlings you planted as well. So making sure it's not too tall to be competitive for light, and not too aggressive to encroach aggressively on the new seedlings. Yeah, and then another thing I always like to stress is, looking not just short term, but looking long term as well. So you want to make sure that, whatever you're planting, you have a, you're considering the longevity of those species, as well as, ensuring that when you plant with native species, you're going to have that native environment that's going to be most beneficial to the wildlife that inhabits the area, as well as protecting that ecological integrity that already exists in the area. So you're not introducing non-native species, and you're trying as best as you can to mimic those natural habitats that already exist nearby. So yeah, again, stressing that native benefit. So oftentimes native species are, the most resilient and adaptive to those local conditions, especially as with, climate change, there's a slow transition there. And then native species and the local wildlife have basically evolved alongside each other. So they're both really well suited to, to recognize either or as the resource and the help for reproduction. Again, yeah, protecting that health of the ecoregion is a big one too. And just ensuring that when you're selecting those native species, you're taking into consideration, that different species age and climax at different rates. So oftentimes, those pioneer species such as aspen or birch will, grow quite fast, but have shorter lifespans than say those white spruce that are, the understory shade tolerant plant, but they're long lived, but just grow at a slower rate. So by mixing in and utilizing different species with different physical layering and different, rates of aging and growth, you're going to have a really good, resilient, and long-lasting ecobuffer. So on our website, Oz, we have a native tree and shrub species database that you can check out, and basically it can, based on your ecoregion, the type of plant, whether it's tall shrub or a long-lived tree, right down to the moisture conditions, soil conditions, and unique traits, whether it's a high suckering species or it's a nitrogen fixing one. You can kind of go through there, and it'll help you kind of see which species, which native species would be best suited to kind of the area you're looking to plant. And then it kind of gives you a general idea of like what would work well for any sort of planting that you're looking at. Yeah, and then stressing that kind of resiliency as far as disturbance agents. So when you design a project to improve that landscape resiliency by incorporating those native plants to that ecoregion, they're again generally locally adapted. So when those disturbance agents come in, there's not as much of an impact as opposed to planting non-native species or ornamental species that aren't used to those local disturbance agents. Whether it's disease coming in, high wind events, flood, insects or pests, and drought. Oftentimes, the more diverse your planting is, it can be a lot more resilient when one of those disturbance agents comes in, as opposed to a really, one or two species, small, one or two row Shelterbelt can be highly impacted by a disturbance agents that comes in and is really impacts one of those species, because when you have that one row that's completely made up of a certain species that is targeted by a pest or an event, you can often see a huge loss to that planting, as opposed to an ecobuffer or any other sort of really diverse planting with lots of different species. Whereas if one's impacted, that planting as a whole is relatively unchanged and can really withstand that impact. So in this kind of scenario right here, we see that kind of what I was saying before, that shelter built of 2 or 3 rows, 1 or 2 species, and if an event came in where species red was targeted specifically by a pest and species orange wasn't well adapted to high very dry conditions such as a long-lasting drought, they can experience that 60 or 50% loss. Whereas when you have that Ecobuffer corridor, so not necessarily just because of a higher number of trees, but because of that higher diversity, when you have that same loss of life, targeting those red and orange species, you still have all those other species that are present that are better able to withstand that specific disturbance. And as a whole, that planting maintains its function, and any sort of loss will be, kind of quickly filled in by that natural selection of those other species, especially when you already have that kind of dense interwebbed forest environment present there. So kind of shows, yeah, diversity is the greater diversity is always your friend for providing greater resilience. So yeah, again, like to stress, best way to look at it is, to look at your local landscape and, kind of see what's growing there, and, why it's doing so well. Because, just taking a walk around your area to any nearby natural areas, if they're close or a little further down the road, is a great place to look at, checking out what grows there in terms of, the shrub layer and some of the taller species, even the herbaceous ground level species, because those are the ones that are probably very well adapted to the conditions around your site, more in a general sense, unless your specific site is really high moisture or anything like that might set it off a little bit differently. But in general, within that local landscape, those are the native species that are going to be best suited to your planting project as far as having the most success at establishing themselves, and already being enjoyed and utilized by a lot of the wildlife species in the areas as well, which includes those native pollinators. Because when it comes down to it, they will expend less energy foraging and less energy seeking them out for pollen or nectar, and they can easily identify them, again, as opposed to those if you were to utilize non-native species. And then, yeah, with physical structure, really important to maximize those ecosystem services by incorporating those different physical layering. So the more multiple layers you have, it's an improved wildlife habitat, because oftentimes different species will nest or forage on different levels of that forest environment. So having those different layers is really good for wildlife corridors. It improves snow catchment and dispersal, as well as ultimately improved wind reduction and odor capture. Mainly because I guess a good way of thinking about it, if you had a tree that was long trunked and most of the foliage was on top, and that's all you had, and the wind would pass underneath. But when you get those different height and width characteristics that Megan was talking about before, you're kind of ensuring that there's always something on all those different layers to provide those ecosystem services. Yeah, and then another thing, again, looking at your local landscape can be really beneficial for figuring out exactly what would do best there. So, when if you're planting on a sloped area, ensuring that the species you're looking at have that really deep binding root system that'll really stabilize and anchor that soil in place. Same with lowland or upland. Generally that moisture is going to accumulate where it's low. So ensuring that those trees and shrubs are adapted to higher moisture is a good thing to look at. And then if it's upland, generally a bit drier, and ensuring species can be either adapted to that or preferring that, and then as well as looking at the soil, if it's a bit sandier soil or more rocky substrate, certain species will do better in those situations, such as lodgepole pine, and then ultimately, yeah, just looking to the site and then taking those site characteristics and comparing them to the plants that you have in mind to see if it's going to be a good match. And then, yeah, overall planting design, many different options. This is a good example of all the different kind of situations you can find, whether it's a riparian planting by the creek, alley cropping in cropland or rangeland to provide that shelter, or a natural barnyard, such as a circular enclosure of trees for horses or livestock. Your traditional perimeter Ecobuffer or Shelterbelt, or anything protecting the farmyard or calving area, or just having those Ecobuffer islands that are kind of in a non-linear pattern or kind of a random distribution to create that naturalized effect. Yeah, so lots to consider depending on the area you are working with. And then if you have kind of a mind, a lot of people are, it's really popular these days to create kind of a food forest. So there's an additional benefit to that planting project, not only providing those ecosystem services to the ecosystem, as well as any sort of production, but also providing you or others or wildlife with the fruits of those species. So you always want to make sure, again, the most effective species would be native species, but not every native species produces a nice fruit. But there are ones that definitely do. So when you're looking at any sort of species for fruit production, making sure that it's going to be in that hardiness zone. So again, native would be the best, but if you're looking at non-native ones, making sure they line up with the hardiness zone, which can vary across Alberta, is important. You want to maximize that sun exposure to produce improved production, and that can depend on where exactly you're planting, and usually incorporate some sort of shelter so they're not completely exposed to high winds. And you want to make good use of those nitrogen fixing species that Megan was talking about earlier. Oftentimes, integrating them within the planting, if they don't necessarily produce fruit, but they really provide that beneficial nitrogen fixing trait, which can extend, within roughly a 20-meter radius sometimes, for increased production. And then, yeah, looking at, if you're curious about some of the good native species, like Saskatoon, wild raspberry are some of the more common ones to consider. But even ones like silver buffalo berry can be utilized. And then interesting note is that chokecherry is actually one of the largest in terms of volume of fruit produced from any wild plant on the prairies. So that's an interesting one, which can generally be found across Alberta. And then again, stressing that longevity consideration. So utilizing those fast-growing species, those pioneer species, to establish those ecosystem services quickly, while also incorporating those slower growing species that will kind of act as the dominant species once that community kind of reaches that climax community that you see in mature forests. Yeah, and then considering site prep, which is an important first step when you're looking at your planting project. So that's generally done to reduce that competition, whether it's from lights or nutrients, or a big one is space or water conditions. Also done to alleviate soil compaction, if that's an issue, to get your project started off on the right foot. So some of the common practices that can be prescribed depending on your situation. Sometimes tilling is necessary if it's really compact, or to reduce a really aggressive established vegetation. Oftentimes, an establishment of a cover crop can help with keeping nearby weeds from reestablishing, especially if you're doing a tilling in a crop area where you might have that dormant seed bank kind of waiting in the soil. So when you do that tilling, it kind of brings up all those dormant seeds, and they take advantage of that fresh ground, open area to really pop out and act as competition to those newly planted trees and shrubs. And then applying mulch, whether it's in the form of biodegradable mats or kind of loose organic mulch, such as wood chips, ensuring that you're keeping livestock out of the area, especially in those first few years, so they don't trample or browse on the seedlings. And then ensuring you have proper, water management set up if that's going to be something that's going to be important, especially in the drier areas of Alberta. And then just double checking on the plantings spacing that you have for your project, because especially in the case of traditional shelter built designs where you have that wider spacing, making sure that whatever sort of mowing or any weeding equipment will be able to fit within those spaces if that's what you're going for. And then last but not least, you can also, to reduce some browse behavior, such as from voles, you can set up some predatory bird posts, or keep some of those natural snags, those dead or dying trees in the area, and those will be utilized by birds of prey. So yeah, talking about mulching, done to reduce that competing vegetation. It helps conserve water in the ground around the seedling, as well as improving the soil condition and regulating that soil temperature. You kind of have two options, consolidated versus unconsolidated. So the first being, biodegradable mulch, which can be laid out in the far right you see there, kind of in that linear planting design. It's really effective, especially when you have that pre-tilled area. Essentially, it rolls out and then tucks in with the machinery that is attached. These can often be rented out from the county. And then after that is laid out, you plant the tree plugs directly into that material, and then you're good to go there. And then when using biodegradable stuff, eventually it will biodegrade, so you don't have to worry about taking that out afterwards. And then we have the hemp mats or pulp mats, which would be in the bottom left there. Again, biodegradable, and those just slide around each species planted. And then you have your organic loose mulch, which would be the straw, wood chips, even grass clippings, can all work. And then oftentimes, if you have that available, it can be the more inexpensive choice, but oftentimes needs replacing more often than some of those other biodegradable matting options. And then some tips for effective mulching, ideally planted or done immediately before or after those seedlings are planted to reduce any sort of weeds popping up, and then ensuring that you're keeping the area around, especially in shelter built design, relatively low in terms of vegetation or grass, because oftentimes that's a prime habitat for voles, and it'll utilize it for cover to kind of feast on those freshly planted trees. Same with those consolidated mulches, giving a bit of breathing room around the trees, so you don't want to smother it. So you kind of want to make that donut shape, and then ensuring that you're covering enough of an area around those seedlings if you're using some of that loose mulching. Whereas if you have the biodegradable mulch or those mats, they're already at a good size to provide that protection. And then, again, always monitoring and reassessing if you think reapplication is necessary, if it's degrading at a fast rate and isn't as effective anymore. Mounding is another site prep option you can do, which often is good if you're worried about not wanting to disturb the soil, whether it's because there's a pretty high weed presence in the soil, as well as providing kind of a microclimate for those newly planted seedlings, because it kind of has that top, middle, and bottom area, each kind of having different characteristics that can be good depending on the species you're planting. So if you're on the top, it's almost like a miniature lowland upland situation, so a little bit warmer, drier, so as opposed to the bottom, again, a little bit cooler, shaded, maybe a higher moisture, and a little bit more sheltered. And then that hinge, which is kind of a mix in the middle ground. So kind of looking at that for how you're going to be planting. Essentially, yeah, kind of a mini tillage operation is what those mounding sites are doing, providing a site of less competition for those planted seedlings. And yeah, choosing planting stock, you have a couple different options. So there's container plugs, which on the left there, it kind of has that, it's all kept together, and the bare root stock where the roots are loose, and then overwintered and hot lifted. So with container plugs, generally these seedlings are 1 to 2 years in age, and are planted directly into the soil, roots and all. And then the bare root stock generally grow in nursery beds, can oftentimes maybe be a bit older, around 2 years. Then they're dug up and sold when they're dormant. So overwintered ones are usually generally for the spring, and they're still in their winter dormancy, and should be planted generally in that frost-free window, which usually occurs around May for Alberta, and ideally before the hot summer months. Whereas hot lifted container plugs, those are the ones that are from summer stock, so they're actively growing, they're awake, and should be planted as soon as possible. And then these guys can be kind of a late summer, early fall planting. And then yeah, it's just some of those things to consider, and kind of avoiding planting during those hot summer months of late June, July, early August, because oftentimes it can be pretty high impact on those delicate seedlings, whether it's from the dryness or the high heat of summer. So again, when planting, it's a big first step, because if you kind of do it in terms of poor technique, that can have an effect on your establishment rate. So we always want to be delicate with the stock, especially the roots are the most important, as well as when if you're storing them, if you can't plant them right away, making sure they're in a cool, moist areas, they're not going to dry out on you, and ensuring that that root ball or root stock is going to be kept moist before planting. And then when you're actually planting, there's a few steps to follow. One being, avoiding times right before or after a high rainfall, because it can really get that area quite wet, whether it's from disturbance from you or popping out on just from having that loose soil, kind of mud situation. So with planting, big thing to consider is using a planting shovel, because it oftentimes has a narrower blade on it, so it doesn't disturb as much area, and it's easier to get into the soil and get the right depth for that plug. Oftentimes, effective technique is to kind of push forward and back, and then slip that or tuck that plug into the soil, and then ensuring you're tapping around it so it's securely in place. And a good thing to do is generally, just give it a slight tug, and if it remains in the ground, that's a good kind of test. If it's too easy to pull out, probably try replanting. But some common mistakes that are made when planting is, not deep enough or too shallow is kind of a more common one. So you want to make sure that it's those roots are, in the ground, and are in the ground at a correct angle, so they're all kind of tucked in linear. They're not at a J root, which can impact the growth of the tree, as well as the overall tree being relatively straight. If it's at a slight angle, that's not a big deal. Trees are pretty good at righting themselves. But yeah, just making sure it's not at 45 or something like that, and ensuring that it's padded down, but not too compact, not too loose, ensuring that planted plug is going to have the best first step forward from how it was planted. And then maintenance, 3 big ones to consider is weeds, watering, and then livestock. exclusion. So with weeding, very important those first two or 3 years when those weeds are at a similar height and level of competition to those seedlings. So that can be done by manually with mowing, weed whacking, hand pulling, light tilling between rows if you have the opportunity, as well as applying fresh mulch if you see some of the weeds popping up, and then watering, especially during the dry periods. Last year was a pretty good example of a relatively dry growing season, so it can oftentimes be quite beneficial after in that initial first season, and that can be done whether through if you have the capability drip irrigation systems or even just a watering truck being available, and then as well if you have nearby dugouts that can be utilized with a solar pump or something like that. Basically, yeah, in those really dry times of the year, it can be a really big help, especially when they're in those first few formative years trying as best they can to establish themselves. Again, that's kind of another plus to ecobuffers. They tend to be a lot more resilient with changing moisture conditions because of that diversity, as well as that greater root system that develops underneath them to being able to access that water and pull it up to the surface rather than that kind of more spaced out shelter built design. And then, yeah, just making sure that if you can to keep the livestock out of the area because they can, yeah, be a big impact on those delicate seedlings. And then, yeah, one last kind of little plug for Oz. We kind of can help out as a not-for-profit with landowners who are kind of considering any sort of projects, planting projects. So we can help with an initial site assessment for the area, figuring out what would work well, and then coming up with a design, working with the landowner to meet your goals, and then kind of helping with supplying any sort of some additional funding to help with the project, whether it's through grant funding or something like that, as well as helping with stock ordering, getting them at better prices than with kind of those bulk orders, and then as well as with the actual planting and then post assessment. Generally, we like to follow up and ensure that that there's a decent survival rate, and monitor for any or troubleshoot any problems that might be impacting the planting, and kind of nipping those in the bud so you can get that good establishment. So you can always reach out to us if you have any questions. We're happy to answer about any sort of planting projects you're having, or any sort of issues, or kind of advice, as well as reaching out to us with a project that you have in mind, and are looking for Oz to provide some assistance with that project. We're always happy to help, as well as reaching out to your county. Oftentimes they have valuable resources to provide, and then as well as on our website, if you go to our resources tab, we often have different fact sheets or manuals that can kind of cover everything from pollinators, or planting for pollinators, or ecobuffers, or live staking, or anything like that. Can always be good to check out. But yeah, as of course, always feel free to reach out to us at that email down there. And that's kind of our presentation for today. And then we might have 1 or 2 minutes here for some discussion or Q&A. So feel free to, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat we can get to, you can post in there, or you can unmute your mic and ask away.
We have one question come in the chat regarding mixing in a bit of potting soil into the areas where you're planting your seedlings. A few things to consider based on that practice. So your native soil will be, is the home to a lot of different native microorganisms. So Bob, help me out here thinking of the name of the indigenous soil microorganisms. I'm sure I'm not saying the right term there.
That works.
Yeah, something like that. The indigenous microorganisms of your soil. So that community of microorganisms supports the development of your seedlings, breaking down organic matter and providing nutrients. So we don't want to impact that biodiversity too much by adding potting soil, which can be sterilized specifically for use in like perennial or annual containers of annuals and things like that. So if you're concerned about soil nutrients or compaction, there's different techniques you can try. And of course, I don't think there would be too much damage to adding potting soil if you feel it is necessary for your seedlings. Let's see, another question in the chat. We have, what would you recommend as a cover crop under newly planted, or newly tilled and planted shelter belt? Depending on the ecosystem services that you're looking for, there's a few different types of cover crops that we can recommend. We typically recommend like a white clover, which will provide a low growing nitrogen fixing ground cover. Bob has a Rolodex of many different really great native flowering species to recommend for your cover crop as well. Bob,
Yeah.
what do you think for Grand Prairie area?
So with Grand Prairie, oftentimes good ones are just utilizing some of the native grasses that are found as well, especially the ones that are kind of widespread across Alberta. So I know like June grass is a relatively not too aggressive native bunch grass that you can include, and then purple prairie clover is a good one for, I guess, kind of more so for the prairies, but it's similar. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing as the white clover, where it'll benefit from any sort of sun exposure and still provide that nitrogen fixing, as well as being an excellent pollinator resource. For Grand Prairie, like yarrow would be at home to seed in for a ground cover crop. Again, they have good root binding for stabilizing the soil and penetrating it for improved soil moisture, and then again an excellent resource for pollinators. So yeah, there can be quite a few, but just looking up what's native to your area and kind of trying to use those native wildflowers or native grasses would be best, especially if that's what you're kind of going for with an Ecobuffer. Or you can kind of use, like Megan was saying, those traditional agricultural used ones for doing a ground cover crop once the crop is off the field.
We've got another question in the chat here. We'll move through our chat questions quickly so we don't run out of time. Brad's asking, is there any funding available federally or provincially to restore or grow a new shelter belt? I'm not sure of provincial funding for shelter belts right now. I don't think our CAP funding programs right now cover off shelter belts. Oz is working to secure some funding through that 2 billion trees federal grant for establishing shelter belts with landowners, and especially for smaller projects less than 10,000 trees. So if you send your information our way, we can include you in our project list for when we do receive funding through that 2 billion trees grant. And there's some other different sources of funding out there. Let's see. Tree Canada comes to mind. If you send us an email, we can shoot you off a list of some of the different funding sources that we know of that you can apply for yourself, or you can apply jointly through our larger project applications. And corporate funding comes in mind as well. We often have access to corporate funding. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to just ask away, I guess. I can share we always like to plug our native species database. It's a great tool to select seedlings that are best suited for your project as well. Let me just open up my screen here. There we go. Right on the top of our Oz website, you can see the native species database button. And then here, you just want to make sure you're clicking on your natural region, and then looking to the different characteristics that best describe where you're planting. So if you're looking for a sandy soil in the boreal region, it'll populate the table here with lots of different selections. Let's see, we're planting under a power line, so we want something nice and short, less than 2 meters. There we go. We can click into our selections here. Let me pick one that I know will have what I'm looking for. Oh, I can't find the one I want. All right, well, frog cranberry, for example. Clicking in will give you some more details on the different characteristics of this small shrub. So you can look to see that as its fruiting has a berry, the edible fruit, yes, the berries, yes, they're edible fruit. It does sucker, the different preferences for soil and the overall height. So a great tool folks can use to select different seedlings, or even another common way to use this would be to look back on different trees and shrubs that perhaps you have an existing shelter belt and you have some holes in it where you've lost some trees and shrubs from your planting project. So looking at the trees and shrubs that are doing really well, for example, if you have, let's see, shrubby cinquefoil, and it's just growing amazingly, you can look at this chart here, look at the characteristics that this species has, and then aim to find some similar species. So aim to target the same soil texture, drainage, and sun conditions, and that'll help line you up with species that will do best given what is already growing well in your area. Before I leave our page, we've got our resources section contains many fact sheets for great resources for landowners to use. For example, controlling weeds by mulching. You can just click on them and there's some information in there to reference related to the topic you're looking for. As well, at the bottom of these worksheets, you'll find the useful references to read more about some of the information that we present here. Always a good idea to make sure you're applying that wood chip mulch in the correct way, so you're not creating a mound right against the tree trunk, but donut shape. So lots of good tips and tricks in these. See, do we have any other questions today?